Well, hello again, everybody, and welcome to another episode. It's the autumn, or at least it is in the UK anyway, and that's kind of my favourite time of year. I love the colours of the autumn, and I love to photograph them too. And this week, I've got a lovely lens with which to do it. It's this one, the 50mm 1.4 full frame from TT Artisans, and it's available in Canon RF, Sony E mount, Leica L mount and Nikon Z mount too. It's an entirely manual lens. There's no automation or electronics at all on this lens. The aperture is manual, the focus is manual, so it's very much an old school lens made in the old ways, and it's very much a competitor for or with vintage 1.4s, and I've got a few vintage 1.4s and I do love them. They're really beautiful. There's some very nice ones. There's the Nikon, for example. Over here we've got the Olympus Zuiko, which is one of my personal favourites. What else we got? We've got this beautiful Minolta Rockall PF58 1.4. This is a really nice lens for colour. So it's going to be an interesting comparison to see how this 50mm from TT Artisans, brand new, fresh from the factory, compares with some of the vintage lenses that we've got here today and that I've shown you in the past. I didn't buy this lens. It was very kindly sent to me by the people at TT Artisans, but as always, I'm going to give you the straight dope, warts and all, about this little lens. So, is it better than a vintage 50 1.4? Well, there are some lovely vintage 50 1.4s about. They're usually cheaper. This lens, the TT Artisans lens, comes in around $235. That's about 180, 190 pounds, somewhere around there. You can expect to pay for a vintage 50 1.4, what, 70, 80, 90 pounds for a good one. So there's quite a difference in price. The vintage lenses are usually cheaper than this one, but they're old, they might have damage, they're almost certain to have picked up some wear and tear along the way in their journey through the years, and they need an adapter as well. At least they do, to go on your mirrorless camera, whereas this one from TT Artisans goes straight onto the camera, no adapter needed. So let's have a closer look at this lens. First of all, on the camera, and there it is on the Sony A7, and it sits very nicely on there. It's an all metal lens. It's actually beautifully made. There's a real feeling of precision with this lens. This ring that I'm turning here, the focus ring, is very smooth and very precise. There's no slop, there's no play in that mechanism. It really is a nicely made thing, and it feels like a quality thing as well. Let's just pop it off the camera so you can see the lens in its full entire wondrousness, and there it is. So we've got aperture markings at the front, the aperture rings at the front, and as you see, it goes in half stops from 1.4, f1.4, right the way around to f16. It's got a partial aperture ring that doesn't, it's sort of a half ring. It sort of begins here and ends around here, so this part doesn't have any aperture grip on it. The markings are, I think, etch primed or some form of printing. I have talked about engraving on these lenses before. It would be nice if they were engraved, but I think these markings aren't going to wear off anytime soon because they're very nicely and finely put on, and they really look the part as well. This is a really lensy looking lens. We've got the traditional depth of field scale here, which is nice to see. And in all ways, this is very much an old school lens. I believe this one has 12 aperture blades. I don't know if we can see them there. There they go. It has a minimum focus distance of 50 centimeters, so that's usefully close, and it's about the same distance, minimum focus distance, you can expect from a vintage 50. It is rather taller and longer than the vintage 50s usually are. That's at infinity, and if you focus to its closest distance it gets a little bit longer, but you can see here that it's certainly longer than taller than the Zuiko lens. Is that a Zuiko lens? Yes, it is. It's taller than if we ignore the adapter, it's taller than the Minolta lens by quite some way, and it's longer than this Nikon lens here that we've got there too. So it really is not a small lens at all. However, it's not a heavy lens, and it's certainly not a burdensome lens. You won't find yourself feeling that you've got a very heavy, unwieldy sort of object with you. This is a lens you can carry around all day. It's also got a nice push on metal lens cap. There it is. I really don't like the screw-on variety. I think the push-on variety is the best kind. I think it's better than the clip-on variety too. And this is very simple. It's just lined with felt there, and you just push it on the front, nice and soft, and it stays on there. A nice little touch. My favourite kind of lens cap. I was very impressed by the colours from this lens. They are beautiful, deep, strong, rich and resonant, very saturated and pretty pumped up, so they're fairly dramatic colours, very strong colours with lots of depth, lots of resonance, and they are kind of characteristic and fairly similar to other Chinese lenses that I've looked at, other TT Artisans lenses that I've looked at, and there does seem to be a sort of a house style with colours from these lenses. They do have, broadly speaking, a similarity, which might be to do with the coatings, might be to do with the glass, might be to do with manufacturing techniques. I don't really know. But colours from this lens are very, very nice indeed. More than a match for any vintage 50 1.4. They're not as saturated as a Helios 40, though, for example, which is a lens that does saturate colours very strongly, or indeed this Minolta Rockor PF58 1.4. That's a very saturated lens as well. But yeah, certainly no problems with colours. Very, very nice, very, very likeable, absolutely beautiful. So let's talk a little bit about sharpness. Well, vintage 1.4s, especially wide open, are not well known for their sharpness. In the film days, a 1.4 lens was used to create background blur, sure, same way we would use it today, but they were also used as a device for letting in just that little bit more light, because light was at a premium in the film days. Most people never shot over 400 ISO, and light really was at a premium, so sharpness wasn't the overriding factor that it's become today. And these old vintage lenses, these vintage 50 1.4s, are not sharp wide open. However, the TT Artisans lens wide open is one of the sharpest lenses I've ever shot. In fact, it's certainly the sharpest 50 1.4 I've ever shot. It is astonishingly sharp, and when I say astonishing, I mean that because I was astonished by it. Like any lens, it'll sharpen up even more if you stop it down, though it's so sharp anyway that the increase in sharpness isn't that great once you stop down, and it's so sharp wide open that there isn't really, or I never found a need anyway, to stop down to get greater sharpness. And I think of the vintage lenses, I think only really the Canon FD can even come anywhere near this one. I don't think it matches it. I think this beats all of the vintage 50 1.4s. So if you like to shoot wide open, as I do, for maximum background blur, then this lens is your friend. This lens will give you fantastic sharp results, wide open all day long, and sharpness, definitely a win for the TT Artisans lens. Right, the next thing I've got written on my little script thing here is the word clarity, because when you look at the images, you can tell this is a new lens. It just shouts new lens. The images just have the clarity of newness, and I don't really know any other way to describe it. Most vintage lenses have had plenty of time to develop. Maybe a minor bit of haze, a little bit of fungus, some wear on the coating, general wear and tear, even just dirt inside on the glass surfaces. This one hasn't. This one's a brand new lens, and the images look clear as crystal. They really are fantastic. There are vintage lenses that have that quality, but as I say, many of them have had time to develop faults over the years. That's not to say though that all vintage lenses are old, worn out, fungus infested things. They're not. Most of the ones I've bought, 99% of the vintage lenses I've bought have been nice and clear, no fungus, no haze, no nothing, but they don't have that new look that this one has, most of them anyway. You can be lucky, it's a patience game and it's a luck game as well. I managed to get this Zuiko 3.5 50mm macro. It's pretty much unused. I bought it together with this little OM2 SP with a 50mm 1.8 on the front. Again, pretty much unused, and they do shoot like new lenses, so you can be lucky. You can find lenses that have that clarity of newness, and by and large most vintage lenses are fine and make great images, but they're not new. And this one is. Right, I've given this lens plenty of praise up to now, and it does deserve it. However, not everything is perfect. There's a very mixed bag with contrast, for example. Contrast is usually excellent with this lens. I mean, really nice, very strong, deep blacks, bright whites, very clear divides and boundaries between the two, no washing out. Usually it's very, very well behaved indeed, but it's best shot with a hood because it will catch stray light, any stray light at the wrong angle, and that will just totally wash out your image. In fact, I've never really shot a lens that's quite so keen to wash out as this one is. Don't get the wrong impression, it doesn't do it all the time or anywhere near all the time. Most of the time it's very, very well behaved, but when it does wash out, my goodness, it washes out, and it washes out like no other lens I've ever seen, actually. So do shoot this one with a hood if you're shooting in strong light, and if you want to keep your contrast absolutely to the max, because when this one goes, doesn't go all the time, but when it goes, it really goes. It vignettes pretty heavily when it's wide open. That's to be expected. All the vintage 51.4s do it. They all have dark corners, and this one has dark corners too, and they are pretty dark, and I think it's on a par really with the vintage lenses. It's not necessarily a bad thing. It can be good in certain shots, in portraits for example, and if you stop it down it disappears and it's pretty much gone by 5.6. Now I do like a little bit of background blur, and a 50mm f1.4 shot wide open is a great way to achieve it. You can stay close to your subject and get maximum background blur that just washes out pretty much all the forms that there are in the background. Even further away, when you pull back, you can still get some subject and background separation. This lens is very, very sharp wide open, so it gives really nice separation. The blur is very smooth, it's very soft. It is reminiscent of the vintage lenses. It's more similar to vintage lens blur than it is to modern lens blur, which tends to be quite bland, and there's plenty of it at f1.4. So the blur is lovely, but there's a caveat because it can turn a bit harsh, and there were one or two occasions when I could see blur that was just, I don't know how to describe it. It just wasn't that nice to look at. It's a little bit jarring, a little bit harsh, and feels like it could do with a little bit of softening up at times. It doesn't happen often, but it does happen occasionally. The background blur it has personality. It changes. It's not uniform. It gives different effects at different distances. So character and personality are one thing this lens is not short of. So should you buy this lens over a vintage 50mm 1.4? Well, of course, it's up to you. It's got to be your decision. The advantages it has over a vintage lens are it's new, so it's not had years and years to pick up any faults. It's very, very sharp. It's sharper than any 51.4 I've tried. I don't know if there are any vintage 51.4s that can match it, but it's certainly a lot sharper than all of mine, and I've got them from all the main big name manufacturers. It's got beautiful, beautiful colour, very deep, very strong, very resonant. It doesn't need an adapter either. It can go straight on the camera, so there's no messing about with adapters, and it's beautifully made to a very high standard of precision engineering. On the minus side, disadvantages, well, it loses contrast more readily than any vintage 51.4 that I've shot. It's easily solved with a hood, but that does mean you have to stick a hood on the end and increase the length of your lens a little bit. The blur can occasionally be a little bit harsh, and it costs more as well, around about £180, £200 or $235. What would you do? Do you think this lens is a better lens than a vintage 50 1.4 that you have? Would you buy this lens over a vintage 50 1.4, or do you think that vintage is the way to go when it comes to this lens and this focal length and this wide aperture? Let me know in the comments box below what you think. So that's it from me for now. Please don't forget to like, subscribe and ring the jolly old bell before you go. And if you enjoy the content on this channel and you'd like to support it and help it grow and develop, you can do that at patreon.com/Zenography. As ever, thank you very much for watching, and I will see you next time for some more Zenography.